The trailer was sitting beside the cabin exactly where Dad had left it, except the boat was gone. For a few seconds, I just stood there staring at the empty metal frame. The straps had been rolled neatly around the winch. The faded Michigan registration sticker was still stuck to the side. There was even a patch of dead grass underneath it where sunlight hadn't reached all summer. But Dad's boat, the 1978 Lund he had spent 20 years restoring, was gone. Daniel came around the side of the cabin carrying a cardboard box. "You're early," he said. "Where's the boat?" My brother didn't even look embarrassed. "I sold it." I thought I had heard him wrong. Dad had been dead for 3 days. I had spent his final week sleeping in a plastic chair beside his intensive care bed while Daniel came and went whenever it suited him. "You did what?" "We needed money for the medical expenses," he said. "Somebody had to make an adult decision. That boat wasn't yours." Daniel finally looked at me. "Neither was it yours, Marcus. You lived close to Dad for 5 years and still never paid for anything important." Sarah stepped out behind him and lowered her voice. "Please don't turn this into another crisis before the memorial." Another crisis. As though Dad's death and the disappearance of the one thing he had repeatedly told us never to sell were minor inconveniences I was making worse. I walked past them into the cabin. Dad's desk stood beneath the front window. The brass padlock on the bottom drawer had been cut. Several folders were missing, including the accordion file where Dad kept receipts. There was also a clean rectangular mark in the dust where a blue envelope had once been. That was when I stopped arguing. Daniel thought my silence meant I had nothing. I decided to find out what he had taken before he learned otherwise. 5 years earlier, Dad suffered his second stroke while carrying groceries into the farmhouse. The first one had weakened his left hand. The second took most of the strength from his left leg and left him struggling with short-term memory whenever he was tired. His doctor said he could still live at home, but only if someone checked on him every day. That someone became me. I owned a small auto repair shop 15 minutes away. I began opening an hour earlier so I could stop at the farmhouse before work. I prepared his breakfast, sorted his pills, checked the furnace, and left his lunch in the refrigerator. At night, I returned to help him shower or change bandages. Daniel lived 90 minutes south in Grand Rapids. He visited on Thanksgiving, Christmas, and whichever summer weekend made the best photos. He always brought advice. "You should put motion sensors in the bathroom. You need a better medication system. You're letting the yard go." Then he would leave before Dad needed help getting into bed. When Dad's savings became tight, I paid for a wheelchair ramp, a new furnace motor, property taxes, prescriptions, and a nurse who came twice a week. I kept the receipts because Dad insisted, stuffing them into a brown accordion file in his desk. "You'll let me settle this someday," he would say. "We'll worry about it later," I told him. That was my mistake. I thought refusing recognition made the sacrifice more sincere. Instead, it made the truth easy to erase. My shop suffered. I postponed adding a second service bay. Customers stopped waiting when I canceled appointments for Dad's emergencies. A woman I had been seeing finally told me she couldn't build a future around a schedule controlled by my father's health. I understood why she left. Daniel called me the son who never moved on. Dad called me dependable. One Thursday morning, he asked me to drive him to a notary's office. "What are we signing?" I asked. He looked out the passenger window. Something I should have handled sooner. 18 months before Dad died, Daniel hosted a barbecue at his new house. He spent most of the afternoon walking relatives around the property, pointing out the outdoor kitchen, the heated garage, and the company truck parked in the driveway. His contracting business had grown quickly. He had bought 2 excavators, hired 6 employees, and taken on commercial projects worth more than anything our family had ever dealt with. Everyone called him successful. Sarah found me alone near the cooler. "He's stretched thin," she said quietly. "A couple clients are late paying. He borrowed against the equipment." Daniel always lands on his feet. That's what he keeps telling me. Later, Dad thanked me for repairing the farmhouse roof before winter. Daniel heard him. Marcus has time for that, he said. He doesn't have a wife, kids, or employees depending on him. Dad's face tightened. He has me depending on him. Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it. After dinner, he brought out paperwork for a durable financial power of attorney. He said someone needed authority to handle Dad's bills if another stroke left him unable to make decisions. I supported him. That decision still bothers me. Daniel understood contracts better than I did, and I was tired of insurance calls, pharmacy disputes, and late notices arriving while I was trying to run my shop. Dad read every page slowly. Before signing, he wrote a restriction in the margin stating that major property could not be sold for anyone's personal benefit. Daniel frowned. It's standard protection, Dad said. You think I'd steal from you? I think authority is not the same thing as ownership. On the drive home, I told Dad Daniel was only trying to help. Dad gave me a tired look. You always defend people longer than they deserve. I thought he was being suspicious because of his health. I didn't understand that he was trying to warn me. 6 months before Dad's final stroke, Daniel arrived at the farmhouse without calling. Dad and I had just returned from a medical appointment. He was exhausted, and I was trying to help him into his recliner when Daniel started inspecting the room. There's dust on the cabinet, he said. The back steps still need paint. What exactly are you doing here all day? I'm not here all day. You might as well be. You're living off Dad's property. I kept an apartment above my repair shop and paid every expense myself. Daniel knew that. I opened the binder where I tracked Dad's medications, blood pressure, appointments, and meals. This is what I'm doing. He glanced at it and pushed it back. That's basic family responsibility, Marcus. Stop acting like you deserve a medal. Dad struck the arm of his chair with his good hand. Marcus has done more than you know. Daniel looked away. Then maybe somebody should explain it. After he left, Dad asked me to open the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside was a blue envelope with my name and Daniel's written across the front. If something happens to me, take that to Ruth. Aunt Ruth was Dad's younger sister. Nothing's happening to you, Marcus. I'm not discussing your death every time Daniel gets under your skin. I returned the envelope to the drawer without opening it. Dad looked disappointed, but he let the matter drop. 2 weeks later, I noticed copies of his bank statements on the kitchen table with Daniel's handwriting across the top. Daniel had started receiving them through the power of attorney. When I asked Dad about it, he said, I want both of you to know what's there. I should have paid closer attention to what Daniel now knew and what he was beginning to search for. Dad's final stroke happened on a Monday morning. I found him on the kitchen floor after he failed to answer my call. He could still breathe, but he couldn't speak or move his right side. At the hospital, doctors warned us the damage was severe. I stayed beside him almost constantly. I slept in a chair, showered in the staff bathroom, and lived on coffee and vending machine crackers. Daniel offered to handle insurance calls and household bills. Stay with Dad, he told me. I'll deal with the practical stuff. I was grateful. While I sat in intensive care, Daniel drove to Lakeshore Marina and contacted Dad's old friend Joe Alvarez. I learned the details later from Joe and the transfer paperwork. Daniel told him Dad's medical bills were piling up and the boat needed to be sold immediately. Joe questioned him because Dad had always said the boat would remain in the family. Daniel showed him the power of attorney document. Joe found a buyer, but the first offer required an inspection later that week. Daniel refused to wait. He accepted a much lower cash offer that could close within 48 hours. Sarah later told me she saw the papers on their kitchen counter. Did Marcus agree to this? She asked. Daniel told her Marcus has no legal standing. The sale money never went to Dad. Daniel deposited it directly into his contracting company's account. At the hospital, Dad briefly opened his eyes on Thursday night. I leaned close because his voice was barely a breath. Blue, he whispered. What? envelope. I told him it was safe in his desk. His fingers tightened around mine, then loosened. Dad died the next morning. At the time, I thought he was worried about funeral instructions. 3 days later, I found the cut lock and the empty trailer. We held Dad's memorial beside the cabin because that was where he had been happiest. Relatives brought food, folding chairs, and photographs. Joe came wearing the old fishing cap Dad had given him. Several people expected the boat to be tied beside the dock. Aunt Ruth was the first to ask about it. Daniel stepped forward before I could answer. I had to sell it, he said. Dad's expenses weren't being handled. The yard went quiet. Daniel held up a printed sheet and said he had reviewed Dad's finances after the hospitalization. He claimed taxes, medical bills, and household costs had been neglected. Then he looked directly at me. Marcus lived 15 minutes away for years. He never built a real career, never contributed much, and still expected Dad to carry him. My face burned. The people who had watched me cancel holidays, close my shop early, and drive Dad to appointments suddenly avoided my eyes. Aunt Ruth came closer. Marcus, is that true? No, Daniel waved the paper. These are the numbers. I went inside to get Dad's accordion file. It was gone. That was when I understood why Daniel had cut the lock. The receipts showing what I had paid were missing, and he was now presenting a carefully selected list that made him look responsible. I returned to the yard empty-handed. Daniel mistook that for defeat. I'm not doing this today, he said. Dad deserves peace. I looked at the relatives standing around him. You sold his boat while he was dying, and you're using his memorial to accuse me of neglecting him. Daniel folded his arms. I kept my voice even. You're going to account for every dollar. After everyone left, Joe called me. Marcus, he said, your brother told me the boat was being sold for emergency treatment. That isn't the story he told your family. For the first time since Dad died, I had something more useful than anger. I had a contradiction. The rumors reached my repair shop by Monday. One customer asked whether I was closing because I had inherited the farmhouse. Another said he heard Daniel had been forced to rescue Dad financially. I wanted to correct everyone. Instead, I stood beneath a pickup truck changing a transmission while people discussed my life as though I weren't there. That night, I reviewed 5 years of business records. I calculated lost work, canceled jobs, and expenses I remembered paying. The number frightened me. I had spent most of my savings and delayed every plan I once had for the shop. I couldn't afford to replace the boat, and I wasn't sure I could afford a long legal dispute. Worse, many payments had been informal. Dad would need a prescription, and I would use my card. The furnace would fail, and I would pay the technician directly. I rarely wrote for Dad in a memo line because I never expected to defend my own generosity. At the farmhouse, I searched the desk again. The cut lock lay in the wastebasket. The accordion file was missing. The blue envelope was gone. But the dust inside the drawer showed where both had been. I remembered the notary's office and Dad's warning that authority wasn't ownership. Aunt Ruth arrived carrying a box. These were in his hospital room, she said. Daniel missed them when he cleared the cabinet. Inside were Dad's glasses, a pocket knife, a comb, and his small black calendar. A receipt from the notary's office was tucked inside the back cover. On the date of our visit, Dad had written one line, original with Ruth. Copy in blue envelope. I handed the calendar to my aunt. Her expression changed. There's something you need to know, she said. Aunt Ruth told me Dad had visited her after the notary appointment. He gave her a sealed envelope and asked her to keep it in the locked drawer of her bedroom dresser. She was not to open it unless Daniel and I disputed his wishes. We drove to her house immediately. The envelope was still there, but the seal had been broken. Inside were 2 blank pages and an empty document sleeve. Ruth sat on the edge of her bed. Daniel came here while your dad was in the hospital, she said. He said Walter needed insurance papers. I left him alone for 10 minutes. The missing letter was another accusation I couldn't yet prove. so I focused on what I could document. Joe gave me copies of the boat sale paperwork. Daniel had signed as Dad's agent and written that the proceeds were needed for medical care. The estate's temporary administrator requested Dad's bank records. No boat money had entered any of his accounts. At my shop, I searched old card statements, canceled checks, invoices, and tax records. I found payments for the furnace, property taxes, medications, nursing assistance, a wheelchair ramp, roof repairs, and groceries. The total passed $50,000 before I finished. Some of Dad's receipts were missing, but my own records told the same story. I called Ruth and asked exactly what the notary had prepared. She remembered Dad saying there were 2 signed originals, not just a copy. One was for me, she said. He said the other would stay somewhere Daniel would never bother looking. I thought of the blue envelope. Then I thought of Dad's boat, his maintenance habits, and the thick manual he kept wrapped in plastic beneath the driver's seat. Daniel might have taken the obvious letter from the desk, but he had sold the boat so quickly that he may not have searched what was inside it. 2 weeks after the memorial, we met at the farmhouse to prepare the estate inventory. Daniel arrived with a binder and acted as though nothing had happened. He submitted a written claim stating that he had advanced money for Dad's medical care and should be reimbursed. He described the boat as a depreciating asset he had responsibly converted into cash. Then I saw several expenses I recognized. The furnace repair, the wheelchair ramp, a 3-month payment for Dad's nurse. Daniel had listed them as costs he had arranged. I paid these, I said. He leaned back. You're saying that now? I have statements. Statements can be assembled after somebody dies. Sarah sat beside him staring at the table. I pointed to the date of the wheelchair ramp payment. You were in Florida that week. Sarah spoke before Daniel could answer. He was. We took the kids to Orlando. Daniel turned toward her. That doesn't mean I couldn't authorize something. You said you met the contractor. His jaw tightened. The estate administrator asked Daniel to provide proof that the claimed reimbursements came from his accounts. Daniel pushed his binder forward. This family doesn't need an investigation. Marcus is angry because Dad trusted me with the finances. I didn't argue. I asked for a complete transaction history covering Daniel's use of the power of attorney. The administrator agreed. A few days later, she called me. The boat proceeds had gone to Daniel's business. Then, within hours of my demanding an accounting, Daniel moved almost the same amount through another account. It looked like he was trying to create a repayment trail after the fact. By submitting his claim in writing, Daniel had turned his excuses into records that could be checked. His need to appear responsible was beginning to expose exactly how irresponsible he had been. The formal accounting meeting took place in a small conference room above the county bank. Daniel arrived with Sarah and kept repeating that everything had been temporary. The administrator laid out the records 1 page at a time. The boat buyer's payment had gone directly into Hill Contracting. No portion of it had been used for Dad's treatment. Daniel said his company was waiting on a commercial client to pay a large invoice. I intended to replace every dollar. Sarah looked down. When the administrator asked whether she knew about the deposit, Sarah answered quietly. He told me we were going to miss payroll. Daniel glared at her. Joe explained that another buyer had offered more money but wanted several days for an inspection. Daniel refused, Joe said. He said he needed the money within 48 hours. The medical bills Daniel used to justify the sale had already been mostly covered by insurance and Dad's health savings account. The remaining balance was nowhere near the boat's sale price. Then the administrator showed the later transfers Daniel had made after I started asking questions. His explanation collapsed. She suspended his reimbursement claim and ordered a full review of every transaction made under the power of attorney. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I kept thinking about the empty trailer. Proving Daniel had taken the money did not restore Dad's boat, his final wishes, or my reputation with the family. As we left, Joe stopped me in the hallway. There's one more thing, he said. Walter kept a notarized document inside the boat's maintenance manual. I saw him put it there last summer. The boat was already with its new owner, but the document might still be on board. The family's version of events began changing after the accounting meeting. Aunt Ruth told relatives that Dad never described me as dependent. She reminded them that I had been the one taking him to appointments, fixing the farmhouse, and answering late-night calls. I showed a few people copies of my records. One cousin apologized. Another said, "You should have told us sooner." That comment hurt because part of it was true. I had expected everyone to notice what I was doing without ever speaking clearly about it. Then I resented them for not understanding. Sarah came to my shop alone. She looked exhausted. Daniel searched the farmhouse more than once before Walter died, she said. He opened mail. He went through drawers. He said he needed to know what your dad had promised you. Did he take the blue envelope? I never saw it, but he came home with papers he wouldn't show me. Daniel continued telling relatives I had manipulated Dad during his illness. Some people believed him because admitting they had judged me unfairly would have required more honesty than they were willing to offer. I stopped trying to win everyone. Joe contacted the buyer, who agreed to search the boat. The maintenance manual was still beneath the driver's seat, wrapped in the same cloudy plastic sleeve Dad had used for years. Inside was a handwritten inventory page listing replacement parts, repair dates, and engine numbers. Behind it was a sealed document. The buyer read the name written across the front. Daniel Hill. That detail bothered me. Dad had not hidden the document from Daniel. He had addressed it to him. Whatever was inside, Dad had wanted my brother to read it before making exactly the kind of decision he had already made. 3 weeks after the memorial, we gathered inside the cabin for the final accounting meeting. Daniel sat across from me. Sarah took the chair beside him, but left several inches between them. Aunt Ruth and Joe sat near the window. The estate administrator placed the recovered maintenance manual on the table. She began with the facts. Daniel had used the power of attorney to sell the boat during Dad's incapacity. He had deposited the money into his business. He had submitted a reimbursement claim containing expenses that were not his. He had later moved funds in a way that appeared designed to disguise the original transaction. Daniel interrupted. I was trying to protect my company. Those employees have families. You used Dad's property, I said. I was going to pay it back. You sold it while he was dying. His face hardened. You've been waiting years to make me look like the bad son. Joe placed the sealed document on the table. Daniel stared at it. Then he admitted he had found another copy in Dad's desk. I read enough, he said. It was sentimental nonsense about keeping the boat in the family. You cut the lock. I needed financial documents. And took the receipts. I took what was relevant. I spread my own records across the table. 5 years of checks, bills, card statements, and invoices. I never asked Dad to reimburse me, I said. That was my mistake. I thought keeping score would cheapen what I was doing. Daniel laughed once. So now you've created a score. No, Dad did. Aunt Ruth opened the recovered document. The first pages described the boat and Dad's wish that it remain in the family. Daniel looked almost relieved. Then Ruth turned the page. This paragraph is addressed directly to Daniel, she said. My brother's expression changed before she read the first sentence. Aunt Ruth read Dad's words slowly. He wrote that I had repeatedly refused repayment, but that he had kept his own record of what I spent to help him remain at home. Attached to the letter were pages of handwritten entries. Furnace repair, $2,840. Property taxes, $4,116. Home nurse, $13,200. Medications, mobility equipment, roof repairs, groceries, insurance deductibles. Dad had written dates, amounts, and short notes. Some came from receipts. Others came from checks he had seen or conversations we had after I tried to dismiss the cost. The total was $68,430. My independent records were within a few $100s of his number. I couldn't speak. Dad had noticed everything I believed had disappeared into ordinary days. The letter instructed the estate to reimburse me before the remaining assets were divided. Then Ruth reached the paragraph Daniel had never read. Dad wrote that Daniel's financial authority existed only to protect him. If Daniel used that authority for personal benefit, every resulting loss, including below-market sales, administrative costs, and diverted funds, was to be charged against Daniel's inheritance. Daniel leaned forward. That isn't legally binding by itself. The administrator nodded. The reimbursement instructions are also included in the signed estate documents. This letter explains the intent and supports the accounting. Ruth continued. Dad wrote that the boat represented summers with both of us, but after his strokes, I was the one who maintained it, helped him aboard, and took him onto the lake when he could no longer manage it alone. He had not left it to me because I was his favorite. He had protected it because I was the person still preserving what it meant. Daniel had assumed selling the boat would give him quick money without affecting his inheritance. Instead, the sale reduced his share. The money he took had to be returned. The loss caused by the rushed price was his responsibility. My documented caregiving expenses were to be reimbursed first. Daniel stared at the table. Dad had predicted not only what he might do, but the excuse he would use afterward. And Daniel's refusal to read the final pages had ensured he walked directly into the consequence Dad had prepared. The estate took 6 weeks to settle. Daniel's share was reduced by the boat's fair market value, my reimbursable expenses, and the administrative costs created by his false claim. The buyer had purchased the boat in good faith, so we couldn't simply take it back. Daniel had to compensate the estate for the difference between the rushed sale price and its verified value. He sold one of his unused excavators and entered a repayment agreement for the remaining balance. Sarah separated their finances. She told Daniel she would not combine accounts with him again until he completed counseling and gave her full access to the business books. Daniel came to my shop one evening. "I'm sorry," he said. I waited. He spent the next 5 minutes talking about the equipment he had sold, the contracts he might lose, and the inheritance reduction. Finally, I said, "You're sorry this cost you money." His shoulders dropped. I was under pressure. So was I. I didn't sell Dad's things. He looked around the shop. "I thought you had nothing to lose." That may have been the most honest thing he said. He believed my modest life meant it had no value. He saw no spouse, no children, no expanding business, and assumed my time, savings, and reputation were available for him to use. I told him I wasn't interested in destroying him, but I would not repair our relationship until he corrected the lie he had told at Dad's memorial. Months later, we held a delayed remembrance at the cabin. Daniel arrived carrying the brass nameplate from Dad's boat. He had contacted the buyer, explained what happened, and purchased the plate after the buyer replaced it during restoration. Then Daniel stood before the same relatives who had heard him accuse me. He read a written statement admitting that I had paid for Dad's care, that he had used the boat money for his business, and that his claims about me were false. It did not restore my trust, but it restored the truth. That was the first condition for anything that might come later. A year after Dad died, I reopened the cabin for the first weekend of summer. I used the reimbursement to stabilize my repair shop. I paid off overdue equipment, hired a part-time mechanic, and finally made plans for the second service bay I had postponed for years. I did not leave town. For a long time, I had felt ashamed that I stayed while Daniel built a larger life somewhere else. Eventually, I understood that staying had not made my life smaller. It had simply made my sacrifices easier for others to overlook. At the cabin, I repaired the dock and converted the old storage shed into a workshop. I filled it with Dad's tools, fishing reels, spare engine parts, and photographs from the years before his strokes. Daniel visited occasionally. He no longer arrived with instructions. We were civil, but not close. Trust returned in inches, not miles. Sarah brought their children to the cabin. My nephew asked me to show him how Dad cleaned an old spinning reel. My niece wanted to learn how to tie the knot Grandpa used. I mounted the boat's brass nameplate above the workshop door. The boat itself was gone, and I had accepted that some losses cannot be reversed just because the truth comes out. That afternoon, I watched Dad's grandchildren walk toward the lake carrying the fishing rods we had restored together. Justice did not return the 5 years I spent putting my life on hold. It did something more important. It made sure those years could never again be described as nothing.